pleasure to be here with you this week after we celebrated the resurrection of our Savior. Uh, if you would join with me in a moment of prayer, we will get started shortly. Lord, we thank you for the gift of salvation. We thank you for being privileged to do your work here on earth. I pray that the information that we share today would help ministries to continue to flourish, to make disciples for all. Amen. I'm delighted to have Foundry Commercial with us today. Foundry is a tremendous ministry partner of the General Counsel on Finance and Administration. Those of you who are following in the insurance market know there's no greater challenge, certainly in my experience in the industry of years. Um, it is the worst market I have ever seen. Foundry Commercial's Mission Property Group is passionate about helping organizations leverage their real estate for kingdom purposes and helping them develop creative strategies around property utilization. Matt Messier is the group's managing director and has decades of experience in this unique space, learning from his own father the tools of his trade. Carlin Beekman is a vice president at Foundry and cheerfully teams with Matt to serve her clients with trust, love, and the utmost care. I will follow along in the chat to track your questions, which we'll deal with after the presentation. And with that, Carlin, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Well, it is such a joy to be with you all. And we have some slides to share, so I'll go ahead and kick that off. And you bear with me to make sure I get everything kind of situated. All right. Well, Matt, I will hand to you first to I know Jeff gave some, but just give us a little context of kind of who Foundry is and how we come into this conversation today.
Yeah, and we'll go through this part about us real quick so we can get to the meat and potatoes, if you will. And one is thank you for taking some time to join this webinar. And if you have questions, we're used to people just jumping in and asking a question while it's fresh in your mind. So, please do so. Again, this is for you all, and we'll try to assist and help any way we can. But just very quickly, Foundry Commercial, we're a full-service commercial real estate firm headquartered out of Orlando. To the left there, you can see where we have actual physical offices. We manage about 90 million square feet of 74 million square feet of commercial real estate. And we do office, industrial, the whole 9 yards. Also development, especially on the industrial side. But Carlin and I are with a group within Foundry that all we do is try to assist churches, denominations, not-for-profits, be good stewards with the real estate that they have. And so, that's really what we're going to kind of go through, and we'll go between Carlin and I. But that's what we want to help is with stewardship, allowing your mission and ministry to dictate how that tool that you have can be better utilized. And so we're going to go through and talk about some things. And so I'll hand it off to Carlin, who is significantly more interesting than I am. Go ahead, Carlin.
No, it's all good. But, one of the things to Matt's point that we have seen, because our niche specialty is only helping churches and nonprofits with their real estate, is this kind of life cycle. And every organization has a life cycle. Every, for-profit company does. And so this is not anything in a silo, but is something that we crafted and customized around church life and just different things that we've seen. And so don't need to spend too much time on this, but I find it's helpful when we think about especially where a property is at and how a property is serving as a tool ultimately for a local church, that this is pretty grounding when you think about kind of where things are at. So just briefly, I'll talk through, I think we've hopefully all gotten to be part of kind of this exciting part of where a vision gets started, right? Someone has a beautiful idea, a way to share the gospel in a cool way. And so they start that vision. And as they start sharing that vision with people and having dialogue, that naturally builds relationships. And people are getting to share in the joy of that together and are, talking about ways they could make it happen here and do different things here. And naturally, that's when ministry starts to occur. You start to go in and feed unhoused populations. You get to go help care for the local, students of the elementary school. You start to do ministry together. And as those things are happening, it's pretty natural that a church is ready for structure. And it wants a building and, staffing and all the different things to be ready, to be able to continue to do that ministry together. And what we have seen is as structure is clarified within the United Methodist Church, a lot of the churches are blessed with having buildings or having good staffing, having support of the conference. And so all of that is beautiful and is a gift and tool towards ministry. But what's important during that time and why we like to start here is because always understanding what God is calling to and the vision that God has called the church to should really always be what's leading the conversation. And so when we say recast vision, we don't say like, doesn't mean you need to change everything, go a totally different route. It's just really the continuation of clarifying where is God calling us to and how are we keeping that at the forefront. And so what we have seen is that when doesn't happen and that vision is not continued to be at the forefront, that can cause fractured relationships. And where relationships are fractured and there's tension between different things, it's harder to do ministry. It's harder to do the things that were really exciting at first. And when ministry stops happening, you're often just left with structure. You're left with the building and people saying, well, we've always done it this way. So why isn't it, working? And so we'll get into obviously a lot of more tangible things today. But we really do feel that having, the clarification of your ministry and the vision that God is calling you to, that is what guides everything around structure, real estate, all those pieces. And so, Matt, I know you love talking about how this fits in with some of that as well.
Yeah, but to go back to what you were just saying, and you kind of said it, but we're not saying you got to change theology or anything that nature. But I'm at a meeting this week, and one of the younger guys says he's like, I don't know, 30. He says he has never in his entire life wrote a check. And back in the day, that's people they wrote checks, and so now obviously you can scan a QR code, you can do a lot of things. And so it's just kind of understanding and trying to relate better to the people you're trying to serve. So anyway, but I do like this. I worked with my dad for many, many years. And he told me, he said, Matt, if you get the first button right, then the rest of the buttons fall into place. And for us, the first button is the church's ministry and mission. Where is God calling you to go or to do, who to work with? Again, obviously it's open to everyone, but you may be, hey, we're called to college students or we're called to this or that. And so, we say ministry should dictate the real estate. If you can really understand the first button, if that's your lens is your ministry and mission, then a real estate strategy can be built around that in order to figure out how to make real estate a more effective tool to do your ministry.
Absolutely. And so we always want to start there because that is truly, as Matt had mentioned, Foundry is a commercial real estate firm. That is, we have the specialty of serving churches, but we help churches with their real estate, but we always start with this piece. And so as we continue on, we just wanted to start with that lens. And so, as you all well know, and obviously we're so grateful for our partnership with the GCFA and with Jeff and United Methodist Insurance. When it comes to church real estate, it is so unique. Matt, I don't know if you want to even share any anecdotes or thoughts around that, because it really is, even when you look at, valuing other commercial or residential assets, what you have learned over the years when it comes to churches and just even, like I said, I don't know if you have any funny stories you've seen over the years too with this.
Yeah, well, I would say this, and again, anybody, if you want to jump in, let us know, but that there's a difference between what a property is worth versus what the insurable value is and so forth. So because most churches don't pay real estate taxes, the county is not really overly concerned with getting the value analysis right, the assessed value and things of that nature. So we have worked with churches that literally their property on the tax rolls was a couple $1 million, and they could get 300,000 for it, they'd be lucky if they sold it. And then others that it was valued significantly low. If I'll do the opposite, $300,000 is assessment value, but it's worth millions. So, there's a lot that goes into understanding the value of a church, from the standpoint of, yeah, what happens if there's a tornado or something versus functionality? How does it work for the church and so forth? So, I don't know if you were thinking about a certain analogy or antidote, but, um, you know, please jump in, Carlin, if you
No, I
help
think
me
that's
remember.
yes. No, you're good. And that really is, I think it's mostly just that understanding of there's all different ways, like you said, and obviously with today's conversation around insurance, yeah, there's the insured value, all the different pieces. And I think, and Jack obviously jump in if you want to steer us a different way, but I think what we're wanting to talk about today is just the way we see it from kind of a marketplace standpoint, how different ways to understand your kind of value of your church and maybe even what pricing could be for the property and how that does impact ultimately being a good steward and understanding kind of what you have. And so with that, I think we wanted to just talk about, and I'm sure many of you know this, but these are kind of some of the key factors we see that have a huge impact on a church property and on ultimately what the valuation or different pricing components could be. A huge piece of this is zoning and future land use. What a county, city, village designates a property, a parcel of land as has a significant value on not only the current, for the church using it, just something good for you all to know, but especially if there is thoughts about doing something different or whether you want to expand and start a preschool, if you do want to maybe sell and relocate, understanding the underlying zoning of what your property has been designated as what it can be and can be used as is crucial. There's ways to change zoning and to go through different processes, but it is a process and it has to go through the local government and often can involve neighborhood meetings and different things like that. I'm sure many of you know this, but churches are often kind of a buffer zone within commercial spaces. So they can sit, between kind of a main commercial corridor and then the church is kind of here. And then there's like a residential component there. And cities like that because churches are, though they're, not a residential property, they are kind of that nice buffer where there's not too much activity happening. It's a little bit of a nice layout. And so I say all that to say we just see a lot of times that churches do have some of that underlying residential zoning, which isn't necessarily bad, but can limit different things that need to happen. Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Well, Jeff, we see you. Did you want to add anything? I know that Carlin asked you a question, but I see you on the screen. Or were you just letting everybody see how good looking you are?
Yeah, it's a combination of both, Matt. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think you're on the right path, Carlin.
Okay.
Yeah. Just wanted to confirm that. I didn't want you to think I was ignoring you.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. Well, yeah,
I did want to talk a little bit about zoning too. So a lot of times, especially older churches, back in the day, a church was pretty much a permitted use in any zone. Um, Governments were much more friendly, if you will, toward churches. And so, whether you're residential, commercial, etc., it was kind of fit in every category. Over time, zoning has changed tremendously. And so many churches, whether you're in residential or commercial or whatever, you're typically grandfathered in for that use. And typically the grandfathering runs with the property, not with the owner. But what we have seen is where the zoning, where churches are permitted less and less, though grandfathered in a number of zonings, and what they have become is special exceptions or variances. And in that way, if a church is looking to move into a certain area, then the local government has a little bit more control, and the neighbors are invited in to give their input, which typically is not a good thing. Um, but so just keep in mind is that you could have a church that's zoned residential R1, like a single family residential, 1 unit per acre. and maybe a few blocks away, the zoning changes and you're in a C3, which is a heavy commercial use, the value of that property is significantly different. So as you mentioned, Carlin, zoning is a really important component to understand not only what you're zoned now, but potentially, like you say here, the future land use or what could it be zoned.
Yeah. And I think that's important. And I'll let you go through the rest of these next. I don't want to take up too much airtime, but I have just, I think we see a lot that when, especially when churches are thinking about how to be a good steward with their property and what they've been entrusted with. I feel like we see churches get excited about, oh, could we do an affordable housing component? Could we have this excess land? Could we unlock that and do, 30 units of affordable or mixed income housing? And that's beautiful and wonderful and can often be a ministry and the, financial win for the church. But I think zoning, we see it so often come at odds with that. And that, there isn't any apartment buildings around there. So the, single family residential neighbors don't necessarily want to see that on that extra 3 acres of land. They viewed that excess land as their kind of community park, with those pieces. And so understanding how those fit together and that it's not impossible to work through the problems, but that there does often need to be a process to unlock some of that value or some of those ministry components, I think is just helpful. So a church leadership and congregation doesn't feel like they're going on a roller coaster. They're not getting all excited about this thing that could happen and then realizing, there's going to be these headwinds. And so having some clarity there, I think is crucial when it comes to just reviewing the property and potential options.
Yeah, and I'll go through these others relatively quick, but location, if you're on a corner and we call a hard corner means that has a light, um, then um, the value could be significantly higher depending on how big the town is and all that. If you're on one side of the street, which is the breakfast side, um, then versus the other side, it could have a significant impact on whether Dunkin' Donuts would like a site over there, because they'll pay significantly more for one side of the street or the other. The size of the property obviously is important from the standpoint of how much can you get on it. If it could go multifamily, what kind of density could you get? Because developers are looking at it, how many doors, as they say, how many units can we get on there, and that will affect value. The functionality of the building itself um, is really important to you all. Is there enough classrooms? Is there a fellowship hall? Parking is extremely important. Back in the day, when church, we went Monday, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and if we had to park 9 blocks away and walk in the snow, we did that. Today, that's just not the case. We have a property we sold recently in Illinois, and it sat like 400 people, and it had 3 parking spaces. It really, really affects value. Excess land. Some of you have been sitting on some land for a really long time and have had the pleasure of cutting grass for 25 years. And, maybe the question is there any other use that we could leverage this excess land? Doesn't mean you need to sell it. It could be a land lease. It could be something that goes well with your mission, like assisted living. We work with the church and they could do assisted living. It would next to it, and they would build a little chapel inside the assisted living, where on Sundays people could come across the street, worship with the folks and their families. And so there's a lot of hey, do I have excess land that we're not going to use? NIMBY, of course, not my backyard. That's always a concern that goes to zoning. Everybody typically loves the church building because that's that local park, if you will. They walk their dogs and all those good things. And so, um, you know, that needs to be factored in. And then the area demographics. Um, and economic demographics are really important, but so is population. You could be on a quote hard corner in a small town, but there's only 500 people within 3 miles, and so the buyer pool is relatively small compared to other properties. So again, what you want to do, we always say, is ask 3 questions. One is, what do I have? What does the property want to be? And then what can the property be? So the property may be, hey, we got excess space and we'd love to put maybe lease it to a preschool or a daycare. You want to stay where you're at, but you got some space you're not utilizing. Well, zoning would be very dependent upon that, because if the school were part of the church, typically that falls under as an ancillary use of the church, so it's permitted. If you're just leasing to a kindercare or somebody like that, then the city may say, no, that's a commercial zoning and you can't use it. So these are the things that you just want to really check into.
So as we're kind of putting together these thoughts, we wanted to provide some tangible, helpful ways that you can understand your value. Some of these you all are probably familiar with, and some maybe are a little different. So an appraisal is it's normally a term that a lot of people are familiar with, and so it can be unique when it comes to church properties. So Matt, I'll hand to you to kind of talk through. I know we have them pretty well summarized here, but at a high level,
Yeah.
and maybe some of the methods.
Yeah, at a high level, you know, we can provide like what we call a broker price opinion, but we're not appraisers. And not just any appraisal, but an MAI, that stands for Member of the Appraisal Institute. And if you were going to go buy a property or get a loan or on your property, whatever, through the bank, they're going to require typically an MAI appraisal. So they're not cheap, depending on the size of your building. Could be anywhere from $2,500 to $5,000 for the appraisal. But what they're going to do is not just look at what do you have, but what can it be, typically. And I think some of the beauty of an MAI appraisal is that if there's disagreement within the congregation on what the property is worth, and again, we're not telling you to sell your properties, we're just saying understanding what you have, then the appraisal will do a great job of kind of creating a level playing field for everybody. And you can say, hey, okay, you think it's worth X. This group think it's worth Y. Somebody else think it's worth Z. Let's hire a professional, somebody that a bank would hire if they were going to make a loan. And let's get a third party arm's length valuation done at. And so usually it brings the church together because everybody says, okay, we hired somebody and now there's not maybe some disagreement. And if there is disagreement still, say someone still says, well, I think they're wrong. Well, tell us what in the appraisal is wrong. Did he not or she use a bad cost approach? Or did you not like the comparable sales that were used? But I think that's always that's, that's always a good thing to do. So, and then the three approaches, they usually don't use the income approach with a church because that's more used like for a warehouse or an office building or what can, rent for. But they're going to look at comparable sales, which sometimes are really hard to find. So it's part art, part science, or the cost approach. What would it cost today to buy the land, build a building, and then they depreciate it based upon certain um, uh, there's a book out there, I forget what it's called, but hey, if the building's, 20 years old, depreciate the rebar this much and da da da. So, but anyway, that's a tool that the church could use if you really want to understand market value. And I think I saw, Jeff, something pop up that said, can you explain market value versus something else? Or I don't know. That was in the chat. But I don't know how to see the chat. So, or do we want to address that?
Yeah, Matt, that was my question for you. Explaining the difference between the valuation that you would use if you were looking what it's worth in the market versus kind of the cost approach, which is something you would use if you were looking to establish a value for your insurance coverage. And
Sure.
with my own rule, I'm asking you a question in the middle of your
Yeah, no,
presentation.
that's fine. And it's a great question. I would say that, the appraiser's going to ask you, why are you getting the appraisal? And, because, are you going to take it to the market? But I think that what you want to do is if it's for insurance purposes, your goal is, hey, if I have a hurricane or a tornado or just really bad weather, the market value typically is going to be less than what it costs to build today. So you want to make sure that you have an appraisal that is based upon what would it cost to build back what you lost. And again, insurance adjusters try to do that. But sometimes maybe they're not giving you the value you want. So I think that there's a big difference between, hey, I want to sell my property. And even in the appraisals, a lot of times they'll say it's going to take a 12-month period to sell the property. Well, and someone would say, I'd like to know what it would, how, what would the value be if I wanted to sell it in 3 months or 6 months? Well, that number is going to be lower because of time. So that's an important question. But if you're doing it for insurance purposes, make sure they know. And hey, we got stained glass here. We got this. We have all these different attributes that need to be included in that appraisal. So if God forbid something does happen, you can compare apples to apples.
Thank you. Perfect.
Yep. Okay, Carolyn, next.
Yes.
Thanks.
Well, I can briefly touch on the survey piece. So some of you probably have surveys on your property. We see very often that churches don't have even a remotely recent survey, and even sometimes have had surveys from 40, 60 years ago that some kind volunteer thought they were cleaning up and ended up actually tossing and can't even find files for it. And so you can always go on the property appraisers, your local county or city, and see at least what your general parcel outline is of here's what our property general boundaries are. But a boundary survey really goes into much obviously deeper understanding exactly where your boundaries are. And then you can even get more in-depth surveys that show easements and different things like that that could be over your property. And if you are considering doing something with your property, this is a really good tool to have. Any buyer or partner that you're looking to bring onto your land is going to want to have a survey, and so sometimes they'll take care of the cost of doing that. But we have found very often that oftentimes churches don't have surveys until they need it because of the different property matter or needing to put up a fence or something like that. And they just really are helpful tools to have and are really good to make sure they're kept organized so that even if there isn't a current property decision made, but that 20 years in the future, someone can look back and say, oh, the trustees at this time did put together a survey. Here's what we have. We know there's maybe some areas of concern, or, we think it's all good there as well.
Yeah, let me just say one other thing. We're dealing with the church right now, and they kind of have a horseshoe driveway that goes around the church building. There's a house on one side, there's like a Masonic temple on the other. But, when we look at the plat and so forth, it looks that driveway and parking around the church is on the other owner's property. And it may have been 70 years ago, the church knew the neighbor, oh yeah, go ahead and put a driveway in or whatever. So it's good to know what you have. And especially like Carlin said, let's say you want to, maybe develop your property and do a land lease with somebody or whatever. A boundary survey is really good. That's what is here, I believe, just kind of showing the outline. And then there's something called an ALTA survey. And that shows easements and pretty much everything on the building. So let's just say you wanted to, someone says, yeah, I'd love to do some assisted living or some workforce housing on the back of your property. An ALTA survey will show, oh my goodness gracious, there's a water easement right through the middle of our property that would affect that development. And so I think a survey is good to have. And at least up front if there's any issues. Because it's always better, and you may have no plans right now, but you say, we're going to do a survey and make sure everything is good and clean, because if we ever decided to do something and, we saw that, so-and-so's building, a foot of their building is on our property, or worse is a foot of our building is on their property. Let's go to them now and figure out if we can do just a quick claim deed for that foot or whatever the case may be. So, and then is the next one title, Carlin, or?
And you briefly touched on this, but I think it'd be helpful for you to compare the appraisal to a BPO. Yeah.
Okay.
Work price minimum.
Okay. Are we going to get to title or no?
We do not have that on here. So if you
All right. So let me just bring that up on this survey. The other thing that's really quite inexpensive, is to go ahead and pull title on your property. We're not talking getting title insurance like when you would buy a property, but you just want to look at the title and make sure there's no old liens on it. There is no deed restrictions. Um, we did a deal for a property in Illinois, and someone had given the property many years ago to the church, and it said if it ever is going to quit being a Methodist church, then it reverts back to the family that gave the land. And in this instance, there's precedent, legal precedent that says after 40 years that goes away. So that didn't interfere with them. On the other hand, in other states, there may be no legal precedent, and it's still important. Or, back in the day, it was a trustee situation and not a corporation, and so it's just good to pull title, and then you ask the title company, hey, just want to make sure there's no what we call clouds, CLOUDS, on title, and that you got clean title. That's always good to have. Or you may find out, hey, we got a lien on our property that we paid off 20 years ago. We need to, tell the bank to remove that. So anyway, but going to your next page, Carlin, the, can you go to the next page? There we go. The big difference between a BPO, which is things that we do, and an appraisal is the appraisal is much more in depth, and it is legally able to be called an appraisal. We're not appraisers, but we basically can give a property description. We pull demographics. We go through the property, give you comments about functionality and all that. We really look at the location on what you have, and then we pull up comps, sales comparables, to and then we typically will give a price range. Hey, we think if you ever were going to do something with your property, you should be able to get a minimum this, but you might be able to get as high as that. So, okay.
Yeah. And I think the good example about this is a lot of things, especially we talked about at the beginning, zoning, functionality, excess land, all those pieces we talked about a little bit earlier on. Those are the key factors we look at when it comes to a broker price opinion to really try to at best understand what a price range. We use the phrase sometimes, what the market could bear, like what we think a buyer pool could pay for the property. And so with that, kind of our last piece here was going to be around potential income streams and ways that churches can leverage their property to potentially have further income to be able to fund different ministry pieces. So yeah, I'll hand to you, Matt, just kind of run through the slide, and I'll jump in.
Yeah. So that's where, today, and especially, is that there's a lot of churches that don't have as many members, tithing may be down, and they're looking for other sources of income. And so there's all types of, again, it depends on location, zoning, all these things we talked about. But some of the things to consider is, hey, do we have extra land that we're not utilizing? We're actually talking to a church, and they have extra land in front of their building on the main road, and it's like an acre and just a little bit. And it's like, hey, could this be someplace for like a Taco Bell or something of that nature? And so, look around and, hey, do we have extra land that we don't really have plans for? Back in the day, everybody would buy maybe more land, and we're going to have a mega church one day. And even my own church, we own 20 acres, and we were like, yeah, if we were to grow like crazy, we would just go and plant a church somewhere. So let's sell off this land, which we sold to a special needs school, which created another ministry opportunity for us to work with those families. Education space, depending where you're at, you may have a piece of the building that you're just not utilizing like you could. Hey, we got this education wing that we only use on Sunday morning, and we only use one classroom. There's a lot of changes going on throughout the country regarding education. A large number of students have left public education, and we're seeing the growth on the private side. And then there's even states that are like here in Florida, Arizona, that are the money is following the students now and not the public school. So here in Florida, it doesn't matter what you make. The state will give you $6,500 per student for you to send your child to any school you want to. And so what we're seeing is an increase in charter schools and an increase in private schools that are trying to take advantage of that because a lot of the parents may not want their child in a public school. And so you're seeing where, hey, they'll come to a church and say, we'll put some money into your building to bring it to code and we'll pay you rent for the next 5 years. Um, Another one is additional meeting space that you may have a very large sanctuary, or you have a sanctuary plus a chapel area. And there are a number of churches that are renting schools or movie theaters or hotels. They're church in the box, if you will. And if they could get something with a little bit more permanency and at a different hour, obviously, then you all would want to use it. Most of the time, people, I always say, you want to use it during the biblical time of 9 to 12. Uh, but we see a lot of churches that may worship on Saturdays or could do it in the afternoon. And it's much more functional for them to be than renting, like I said, a movie theater or something of that. A lot of folks started renting movie theaters and schools. And then when COVID hit, they were kicked out of those facilities because they were closed down. So, the key is to go through the property and figure out um, what space would have some demand to it. Carlin, I think you recently did a deal for the Lutheran Church or Disciples of Christ to a Lutheran church where they just rented office space, correct?
Yep. Yeah. Church had a educational wing that they were interested in leveraging. And we thought it would be more of a traditional daycare or something like that. But yes, another church just down the street from them needed more office space, and it ended up being a very beautiful win-win from a they had, adults in the space, so a little less wear and tear, but then also were able to, with those extra monthly rental incomes, supplement, their pastor salary and be able to call another pastor. And so there's all different ways of looking at it, but understanding kind of what do we have? How do we use our space for ministry? And maybe what are areas that aren't getting used as much? Often opportunities for churches to explore. We just have a couple more slides on this, and then we'll jump to questions. Matt, I believe this is a church that you are working with that is very similar to what you were just talking about, that has excess kind of worship space. Do you want to speak to kind of how that's being looked at and how they're using it?
We're doing that right now, and we have a couple interested parties. One's another church, one's a school. Um, that And so I'm colorblind, but I think the part to the right is enclosed in red or orange or something. That area there was their original building, and then to the left is where they have their new sanctuary and classrooms and so forth. So they don't need all that space. And so what we're doing is leasing the building to the right, which has its own kitchen and classrooms. It's really almost a turnkey separate building, and including the parking there that's highlighted. They own all that land around there, but basically saying, hey, why don't we take that and turn that into an income stream? And that can go anywhere from $6,000 to $8,000 per month. And then the tenant would share in some of the expenses. But that's an example of, hey, we have the space, we're not utilizing it. Yeah, we utilize the kitchen maybe once a month or whatever. But we can get along without that. So let's find a tenant. So like I said, we have two groups who have made offers on that space. And that would create some very good income for the church as they rebuild.
And these are just kind of some last minute, almost more housekeeping pieces when it comes to having a tenant or someone that you are sharing some space with. And we're happy, obviously, if you want to reach out to us, and we want to give time for questions. So we'll kind of wrap up here in a second. But it's just important to make sure that a tenant is covering their own costs. We often see that utilities and some wear and tear and some different pieces are not included in a lease. It's just kind of a gross lease that covers kind of one monthly payment. And sadly, if those things are not being reviewed, we see that churches can really end up subsidizing, that they are actually contributing more towards the tenant. They're not really receiving much income or even breaking even. And so that kind of sits with protecting the downside as well. You always want to have a really good attorney. A blessing of being part of the United Methodist Church is that through your conference, there's normally some good, a chancellor or some different teams that can review a lease or sharing agreement, and that is crucial. You really want to protect long term the church's position in something like this. And then depending on a group's use, we see this a lot of times with educational users. A lot of churches don't have fire sprinkler systems or different things like that, and that's required, for daycare or school users to have. And so there can be code requirements that are triggered when you bring in different uses into your space. And so it's really important that that's reviewed. And frankly, it depends on the market, but we often see a tenant absorbs that cost to change those things as opposed to a church having to subsidize it. And then the last piece, and this is where having to a really good accountant or people from your conference is helpful. You do want to be careful that when you really receive unrelated business income, so that can often happen when you have tenants in your space, that there can be tax implications on that. And so you just want to be aware of it. It's not a reason to not explore something like this, but it's good to be prepared so that you're not caught by surprise a couple years down the road. So I think from here, I would love to, we have some thoughts around, next steps in different ways. A lot of it is, the continued, to go back how we started, the continued clarification around what God is calling your church and your conference to, and making sure that stays at the focus as you consider these other things. But I think, and if it's okay with you, Jeff, I'd love to kind of stop dominating the screen from a sharing perspective and be able to have some conversation.
Sure. One, as the insurance guy on the webinar today, I will post a link in the chat. We have an excellent, if I do say so myself, webinar on the insurance implications of renting out third-party space. And would also mention that the General Counsel on Finance and Administration has some really good resources. But to echo your point, it is really important to have local legal advice, someone who understands your specific situation, and also an accountant who understands the tax implications of whatever it is you're doing. Because one of the last things you want to do is lose your tax status. Um, you might you might end up paying unrelated business taxable income, but still have a net gain. So that's a question to consider as you run through that. Um,
Well, I was gonna just jump in, Jeff. It's a great question, and again, we are not attorneys. Talk to your attorney, talk to your CPA. But our experience has been that if you rent to a for-profit group, and we just sold a building in Chicago for the Presbytery, and I think 15% of it was occupied by a Montessori school. The local municipality put 15% of the assessed value on the tax rolls, if you will. And so, and then they charge that, the landlord charged that to the tenant. But, but yes, some groups may say, some cities may, we're going to put the whole thing on the tax rolls. And then that doesn't make any sense. So and then on unrelated business income, it's kind of an odd thing, but, and again, verify this. I always tell Carlin, the only thing I know 100% is the Lord's going to return one day. Everything else is 99% and less. Okay. So, and, but, that, if you have debt on your property, unrelated income tax will kick in. If you don't have debt on your property, it doesn't kick in. That's been our experience. That's been conversations with a couple CPAs. I know at my own church, that was what happened. I don't understand that rule, but you want to make sure you check all your boxes before you sign anything so you can know the true cost or the true income you're going to get from that tenant, as opposed to, you sign something with them and then oh, we're responsible for when the HVAC breaks and they, or when there's a plumbing issue and we rent it to a preschool and kids keep flushing Matchbox toys down the toilet and we're the ones picking up the tab. And so, those type of things, or we didn't know we'd have unrelated business income. So you want to do all your homework up front to make sure at the end of the day, I'm renting for this. I'm hoping to net this, and that's real. I've done my homework to know.
Well, it's in Proverbs, right? With many advisors, plans.
Yep.
See. So, couple quick questions for you. Um, how does one find the zoning regulations that apply to your church?
Yeah. I think that the best place to start would be with your county's property appraiser. That is probably 80% of the country. That is where your zoning lives. Every once in a while, smaller towns, villages can have their own zoning kind of ordinance and different things. But if you start with your county and try to look it up, a lot of times they have an online portal. You can put in your address and it will give you the information. But if that doesn't happen, calling them and calling the property appraiser as your first step just to ask, they normally can pretty quickly tell you either what it is, or if they can point you in the right direction for who to call.
Yeah. And the planning department, usually we'll have that. And someone just said, "Hey, I live in a township." A lot of times, if it's smaller, you'd call and because they don't have like, Chicago, 90 different zonings, and if you're living in a more rural area, it's going to probably be a lot less, but call oftentimes and they'll be helpful. If you still have a problem, we're happy. Call us. We're happy to, have our folks look it up or try to find it. But it's pretty accessible.
We recommend an insurance reconstruction cost evaluation every 3 to 5 years. Are you all a good source for that sort of valuation?
Wh I would say, we're a good source to help you with market pricing and things of that nature. But I would call an appraiser and say, "Here's what we're doing." And again, if you have an issue, we have some relationships where they may say, "Oh, you may be able to give them some basic information, um, and they'll be able to tell you." Or I guess your insurance company, hey, they'll tell you what the quote insurable value is. Again, you want to just make sure that's enough in the event that something happens. And so again, I believe that an appraiser or somebody like that will be able to help you really well with giving you a good number that's reliable on, if something happens.
Do you see what are some of the most common mistakes you see when people are looking at property valuations?
I'll jump in with one thought. I know Matt said it at the beginning. I think a big miss is when you look at what the county kind of tax rules say your property is worth. To Matt's point earlier, we see it so wrongly on both sides. It's not always way too much. It's not always way too low. It's just wrong normally. And so I think that is to take that and to make decisions on it or to feel grounded in that as accuracy, I think is a mistake.
Yeah. And if it were on your house, um, if my tax assessment's low, I'm typically not going down to the county to say, "Hey guys, if it's high, I'm probably going to the county to tell them, right? So, yeah, I see Andrew shaking his head. So you're as bad as I am, Andrew, is on that stuff. So, but with churches, because you don't pay anything, no one cares, either party. So there's that, and then I do think that um, there that sometimes people there's if you had let me just put this, let's say you had marble floors in your church and all this high tech, high church type stuff. The insurance companies a lot of times don't know the value of stained glass or things of that nature. And some people think stained glass is really expensive, and it just really depends. We saw the church in Selma, Alabama, and everybody said, "Man, this stained glass is like Lafarge or some of these famous ones, and it's worth all this money." I sent it, took a bunch of pictures, sent it to a stained glass consultant. They said, "No, that stained glass was bought from a Sears catalog." And because apparently Sears back in the day sold everything, this was like almost in the 1910s. So what they thought was this hundreds of thousands of dollars of stained glass was really Sears stained glass. And so, and so you want to be careful there that the insurance company is not charging you a ton of money for stained glass when it really doesn't have that kind of value. So special things should be, I think, looked at. And then the last thing I would say is your electronics. Is you know, uh, some churches, all they have is a basic sound system, and that's fine. But some churches may have a $250,000-$500,000 sound system. What is really the value today, since technology is going so quickly, that you had something like you mentioned 3 or 5 years ago? I don't want them to give me the value of that system today because it's going to be a lot less than what it would be to get new tech today. So
You'd get like kind and quality, and
yeah,
actually, the old system would be replaced with something that probably is smaller, sounds better, and costs less.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think I would say those are a couple areas just to be more specific on to make sure the stained glass or, some of the high church things that might be in there. And then technology would be another one.
Mhm. Yeah, the stereo I bought when I, got out of college would fill a room and, doesn't sound as good as a Bose Wave radio, right?
No, you're right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Uh-huh. Yep. So, anyway, I'm showing my age again. I'm not old, but I've been around a long time. Um, I I don't see any more questions. Do you have any concluding remarks?
I think the only thing that I would add is we are here. I know you mentioned at the beginning that we're a partner of the GCFA, and we're super honored to do that. So we help a number of annual conferences, local United Methodist congregations, and Methodist agencies with their real estate matters. So we are here as a resource if anyone has questions following this, or is thinking about doing something with their property, whether that is maybe redevelopment, maybe selling or relocating, leasing out some space. That is exactly in Foundry's wheelhouse. So we are more than happy to be a sounding board and potentially a partner if that's something that anyone listening now or in the future would be interested in.
Terrific. Well, we're delighted that you were here today to share your expertise with us. And as Andrew said, there will be a link to the archived version of this, and you will get a copy of the slides. We're here if you have questions. And just want to thank you again for joining us, everyone, panelists and attendees. And I ask only that you would go forth and make the most of the gifts that God has entrusted us with. And y'all have a blessed week. And thanks again. Take care.